Listen, we're about to begin our story. When we come to the end, we will know more than we do now. Once there was a goblin, a demon. He was laughing his head off. Why? Because he had invented a mirror which reflected everything beautiful is hideous and ugly. The loveliest landscapes looked just like boiled spinach, and people appeared in the mirrors twisted and hideous. If a serious thought passed through anyone's mind, it showed up on the mirror as a twisted grin. One day, the goblins decided to take the mirror up to heaven to make fun of God and the angels. As they carried it higher and higher, the mirror shook and shivered until, disaster, it smashed into 1,000,000 trillion pieces. And the pieces of the glass flew all over the world. And sometimes the splinters of glass would get in people's eyes, and then they would see everything as twisted and horrible, for one splinter of the glass had the same properties as the whole mirror. And sometimes the splinters would get in people's hearts, and that was even worse, for then their hearts would turn to lumps of ice. The bits of the mirror are still flying around the world. This is the story of what happened to some of them. Once, in a great city where most people couldn't have gardens, there lived a boy and a girl who were the dearest of friends. They were next-door neighbors. They lived in attics of tall houses that practically touched at the top. Their parents both had window boxes, and in them they grew vegetables and rose bushes. And in the summer, the children would sit on the roof and talk and play. But in the winter, there was no more sitting on the roof. They would take a coin and heat it up on the stove and then press it against the frosty window pane and make a peephole. His name was Kai, and hers was Gerda. And every day in the winter they sat in the attic, and their grandmother told them stories, while outside the snowflakes fluttered down. "Listen to the snow," the grandmother said. "It sounds just like bees humming." "And have the snowflakes a queen?" asked Kai, for he knew that real bees did. "Oh yes," said the grandmother. "Where the snowflakes are the thickest, there is the queen. And she flies to the window panes and makes patterns like stars and flowers." "Oh yes, we've seen that," said the children. Could the Snow Queen get in here?" said Gerda. "I'd like to see her try," said Kai. I'd put her on the stove and melt her." And the grandmother laughed and told them other stories. That night, Kai dragged a chair up to the window and looked through the peephole. He saw the snowflakes coming down. One was larger than the others. It came closer and closer to the window, and now it appeared to be a beautiful woman, made entirely of ice, but she was real. She looked at Kai and beckoned to him, and Kai jumped down from the window. The winter passed, and the spring came. The birds returned, and then it was summer. The roses had never been more beautiful than that year. Gerda had learned a song about roses. "In the vale the rose grows wild, children play all the day. How lovely to be a child." "Oh!" cried Kai, "something's in my eye! Oh, something's in my heart! Let me see," said Gerda. And she looked at his eye. He blinked. "Oh, it's gone now." But it wasn't. It was one of those splinters of glass. One had lodged in his eye and the other in his heart. I'm sure you remember about them from the demon's mirror. "Oh," he said, "that rose has a worm in it. Oh, that rose is crooked." And he grabbed the roses and ripped them to shreds. "What are you doing?" said Gerda. And he grabbed the third rose and tore it before her face. That winter, when the grandmother told them stories, he said it was baby stuff. And he put on the grandmother's glasses and made fun of her and back of her. And then he took to walking up and down the street and imitating and making fun of people, especially if they were odd or different. "Oh, how clever and witty that boy is," the people said. But of course, it was just the splinters of glass in his eye and in his heart. One day, Kai came in with his sled. "I'm going off with the others in the town square," said Kai. And he took his sled to the snow-covered square, where the big, bold boys would tie their sleds onto the backs of farm carts and be pulled around on a merry trip. A white sleigh pulled into the village square. The driver was wearing white fur. The driver turned and beckoned to Kai. He tied his sled to the back of the sleigh, and off they went as fast as could be through the city gates, out into the countryside. They went as fast as the wind. Kai called out, but no one heard him. He tried to say the Lord's Prayer, but all he could remember was the multiplication tables. Then the sleigh came to a stop, and the driver stood up. It was the Snow Queen. "You must be nearly frozen," she said to Kai. "Come into my sleigh." He sat down under her bearskin rug, but he felt as if he was sitting on a snowdrift. And then the Snow Queen kissed him, and he felt no more cold. She kissed him again, and he forgot entirely about Gerda and the grandmother. He looked at the Snow Queen. In his eyes, she was perfect. He told her that he could do mental arithmetic with fractions, and he knew the square miles of all the principal countries and their inhabitants. And the Snow Queen smiled at him, and he began to think that maybe he didn't know as much as he thought. And then the sleigh flew up into the sky over the icy snowdrifts, and the wolves howled, and the great silver moon shone, and Kai slept at the Snow Queen's feet. And what of little Gerda? When Kai didn't come home, she asked the other boys what had happened to him, and they said he'd tied his sled to a sleigh and it went out the city gates. And then people began to say that he'd probably drowned in the river. Oh, what a long, sad winter it was. And then it was spring, and the warm sunshine returned. And Gerda said, "Little Kai is dead and gone." "I don't believe it," said the sun. "He's dead and gone," she said to the swallows. "We don't believe it." And at last Gerda didn't believe it either. She decided to go down and ask the river if it had taken little Kai. Early in the morning, she kissed her sleeping grandmother and took her new red shoes and went down to the river's edge. She threw in the shoes into the water and said, "Did you take little Kai?" The waves of the river brought them back to her, as if to say, "We didn't take him, and we're not going to accept your dearest possession." Maybe I didn't throw them hard enough, thought Gerda, and she got into a little boat that was tied up. She threw her shoes as hard as she could, and the movement made the boat come loose. And it drifted along in the river's current with the little red shoes following in the water behind. Maybe the river's taking me to Little Kai, she thought. She passed a curious house with a thatched roof and red and blue shutters, and she called out. From the house came an old woman with a great straw hat covered with painted flowers. She took her shepherd's crook and pulled the boat into shore. "Oh, you poor dear child," she said to Gerda, and Gerda told her story. "Oh, Little Kai hasn't come by here, but he's sure to come into my house." The old woman fed Gerda cherries, and then she began to comb Gerda's hair. And as she combed, Gerda forgot entirely about Little Kai. You see, the old woman knew magic. She wasn't a wicked witch, but she liked to use her magic to get what she wanted. And right now, she wanted Gerda to stay with her. She went out into her flower garden and pointed her stick at the rose bush, and the rose bush sank down under the earth. She was afraid that if Gerda saw the roses, she would remember Little Kai and leave. And then she took Gerda out to her beautiful garden. Soon Gerda knew every single flower there, but yet she had a feeling that something was missing. One day she sat in the house and saw the woman's straw hat covered with the painted flowers, and on the hat was a rose. "I wonder why there's no roses in the garden," thought Gerda. The old woman had forgotten to make the painted rose disappear. See what happens when you don't keep your wits about you? Gerda went out into the garden, and she cried, and her tears watered the ground right where the rose bush had sunk, and it came up out of the ground again. And Gerda hugged the rose bush, and as she looked at the roses, she remembered Little Kai. "Do you know where Kai is?" she asked the roses. "We've been under the ground, where the dead are," the roses said. Little Kai wasn't there. Then Gerda went from flower to flower to ask them if they knew about him, but they knew only their own songs and stories. Then Gerda went to the gate of the garden and fumbled with the rusty latch and pushed it open and went out again into the wide world. It was autumn. Time had not passed at all in the enchanted garden. "Oh, I've lost so much time," thought Gerda, and she wandered out into the cold, dreary day, barefoot. What a sad, desolate place the wide world was. She hadn't gone along very far until she had to stop and rest, and she saw a raven in the snow looking at her. "Caw, how do?" said the raven. And Gerda told the raven her story and asked him if he'd seen Kai. "Could be," said the raven, and Gerda was so happy she hugged the raven and nearly squeezed him to death. Caw, careful," said the raven. "I think perhaps now Kai has forgotten you for the princess." "Does he live with a princess?" said Gerda. "In this land where we are, there is a very clever princess. One day she decided, why shouldn't I be married? And she decided to find a partner for herself. But she wanted one who could talk very well, not one who just stand around and look important. Now, all I'm telling you I know is true because of a tame sweetheart that lives in the palace, and she told me everything. Well, the newspapers announced that anyone who had wanted to marry the princess just had to show up at the palace and prove that he was a good talker. A great crowd of fellows showed up, and they certainly could talk. But when they saw the palace and the guards dressed in silver, they were struck dumb. "What of Little Kai?" said Gerda. "I'm coming to that. On the third day, a chap showed up, and he was as brave as could be. He walked right up to the guards in silver and said, 'Must be dull work standing there with nothing to do. I'm going inside. And as he walked up the steps, his boots squeaked. I'm sure that's little Kai, Gerda said. I remember his squeaking boots at the grandmother's house. But did he win the princess? Well, when he talked, he spoke as well as I do myself, or so my tame sweetheart tells me. And the princess was so impressed with him that she picked him. I'm sure that's little Kai. He could do mental arithmetic with fractions. Oh, I want to go and see him. Nothing easier. My tame sweetheart knows a secret back stairway. And the raven led Gerda to the back door of the palace. Wait here. Gerda was frightened and excited. In her mind's eye, she could see little Kai. Then the raven led her up the stairs, and there was his tame sweetheart and a candle on the table. Oh, my fiancé has spoken so kindly of you, said the tame sweetheart. Pick up that candle and follow me. Gerda took the candle and walked up the stairs. It seemed as if someone were following her. It seemed as if there were horses there with long legs and lords and ladies. Those are only dreams, said the tame raven. Then they reached the royal bedchamber. There were 2 beds like lilies. One was white, and in that one slept the princess. The other was scarlet, and in that one Gerda knew she must look for little Kai. The sleeper had brown hair. She was sure it was him. She pulled aside a scarlet petal, and the dreams came rushing back to the sleeper, and he sat up. It was not little Kai. The princess sat up in her bed and asked what was going on. Gerda told them her story and cried. Oh, you poor thing, said the prince and princess. Then the prince got up and let Gerda have his bed. As she slept, she dreamed of little Kai in a sleigh, surrounded by angels. In the morning, she was dressed from top to toe in silks and velvet. And she was invited to stay in the palace as long as she wanted. Oh, please just give me a pair of boots and a horse so I can go out again in the wide world and search for little Kai. Well, the prince and princess not only gave her boots, but a little fur muff as well, and a golden coach pulled up in front of the palace. The prince and princess helped Gerda in, and the raven, who by now had married his tame sweetheart, flew along for part of the journey. Farewell, called the prince and princess, and the raven flew to a tree and watched as the golden coach went deeper and deeper into the forest. It's gold. It's pure gold, said a band of robbers. And they stopped the coach, killed the coachman, and pulled Gerda out. Oh, she's a tasty one. She looks as if she's been fed on nut kernels. How delicious she'll be, said an old robber woman, brandishing a sharp knife. Ah! She screamed, for her own daughter had jumped on her back and bitten her on the ear. No, said the little robber girl. I want her for my playmate. She shall sleep in my bed, and I shall take her muff. And the little robber girl was so willful that she was given her own way. She climbed into the coach with Gerda. Now, she was about the same size as Gerda, but much sturdier, with broad shoulders and dark skin. I won't let them kill you, she said. You're going to be my friend, unless you displease me. You're a princess, I suppose. No, said Gerda, and told the robber girl her story. Then they came to the robber's castle. There was a great hall that was covered with cobwebs and smoke. After they had eaten, the robber girl dragged Gerda to a corner where there was a pile of blankets. High up in the ceiling, there were hundreds of wood pigeons. Those are my pets, said the robber girl. But this is my special pet. And she pulled out a reindeer tied with a rope to a ring in the wall. The robber girl took out her knife and tickled the reindeer's neck. He's my very special friend. Bedtime, she called to Gerda, and she pulled her down under the pile of blankets. Are you going to sleep with that knife in your hand? Said Gerda. I always do, said the robber girl, and she went to sleep. Then Gerda heard, coo, coo. The wood pigeons were calling out. We know where little Kai is. We saw him in the Snow Queen's sleigh. Coo. You know where he is. Where is he now? Said Gerda. Coo. He is in her palace. Ask the reindeer. Yes, said the reindeer. I know very well where her palace is. It is in Lapland. The next morning, Gerda told the robber girl what the pigeons and the reindeer had said. The robber girl went over to the reindeer. You really know where Lapland is? Of course, he said. I was born and bred there. Well, as much as I'd like to go on teasing you with this sharp knife of mine, I'm going to let you go. But you must take my friend to the Snow Queen's palace so she can rescue her friend. I'm going to give you back your boots, she said to Gerda, but I'm going to keep your muff. It's much too nice. You can have an old pair of my mother's gloves, and here's 2 loaves of bread and a ham. And Gerda sat on top of the reindeer's back, and the robber girl took her knife and cut the rope. And the reindeer ran off with Gerda and the provisions. Goodbye, said the robber girl, and off they went over the snow, and the wolves howled. In the sky, it was filled with brilliant lights. Oh, there are my dear northern lights, said the reindeer. And when they had finished the loaves of bread and the ham, they were in Lapland. They came to a house where the roof reached right down to the ground. Inside was an old Lapp woman. She was frying a fish over an oil lamp. Gerda and the reindeer told her their story. Oh, you poor dear children. Oh, the Snow Queen, she's not in Lapland now. She's in Finnmark, setting off those northern lights of hers. You must go see my friend, the Finn woman. She's much smarter than I am. I will write her a note. Oh, I have no paper. I will use codfish. So while Gerda was eating her supper, the Lapp woman wrote a note on a piece of codfish and gave it to them. Then Gerda got back on the reindeer's back, and off they went to Finland, while overhead the northern lights gleamed violet. They went into the Finn woman's house. It was so hot there. The Finn woman was hardly wearing any clothes, and she immediately loosened Gerda's clothes and took off her boots and gloves, and she took a great hunk of ice and put it on the reindeer's head. She took the piece of card and she read the message from the Lapp woman over and over until she'd memorized it, and then she cooked the codfish. She wasted nothing. Please, said the reindeer, can't you give Gerda a magic spell so she can defeat the Snow Queen? Listen, said the Finn woman, taking the reindeer aside and putting another lump of ice on his head. Little Kai is in the Snow Queen's palace. He thinks everything is perfect there, but it's only because he has a splinter of glass in his eye and another in his heart. Only Gerda can free him from that. But don't you see how all men and beasts want to help her? That is because she is a pure, innocent child. Now you must take her to the edge of the Snow Queen's garden. By the bush with the red berries, leave her there. So the Finn woman picked up Gerda, put her on the reindeer's back, and off they went. Oh, said Gerda, I've left behind my boots and my gloves. She was freezing. They came to the edge of the Snow Queen's garden by the bush with the red berries. And the reindeer put Gerda on the ground and kissed her goodbye on the lips, and tears trickled down his face. He was off. Gerda was alone, without boots, without gloves. And suddenly she saw snowflakes looming before her. They grew bigger and bigger. They were the Snow Queen's frontier guard. And now they took on horrible shapes. Some looked like porcupines, some had white snakes in their hair, and some looked like polar bears covered with icicles. Gerda said the Lord's Prayer, and her breath formed a cloud. From the cloud came an army of angels with spears and shields, and they did battle with the Snow Queen's army and defeated them entirely. And then they patted Gerda's hands and feet until she was quite warm. And then she walked on to the Snow Queen's palace. The palace was made of blocks of ice. The wind howled through the halls, which were lit by the northern lights. In a great room, little Kai sat, nearly blue with the cold, nearly black with the cold. His heart was nothing but a lump of ice. The Snow Queen told him that if he could spell out a certain word, she would give him the entire world. But try as he could, no matter what shapes of ice he fit together, he couldn't spell out the word. And the word was eternity. The Snow Queen flew off to the lands of the south, and Kai was all alone. Suddenly, Gerda walked into the hall. She ran to him. She put her arms around him, and she kissed him, and her tears washed over his face and washed out the splinter of glass in his eye. Kai looked into Gerda's face. In the vale the rose grows wild, children play all the day. How lovely to be a child. And Kai began to cry, and his own tears washed out the splinter of glass in his heart. And the blocks of ice flew about, and by themselves they spelled out eternity. And hand in hand, Kai and Gerda walked out of the Snow Queen's palace, through her garden, back to the bush with the red berries. And there was the reindeer waiting for them with a doe, and the doe gave the children milk to drink. And they hopped on the deer's backs and went off to the Finn woman's house, and then to the Lapp woman's house, and she gave them new clothes and a sleigh to ride in, and they rode south in the sleigh until the snow melted and the grass began to show green. They got out of the sleigh and started to walk home.